So Richard is a writer and broadcaster from Northern Ireland and the author of numerous books about politics, including Against Austerity and Corbyn, The Strange Rebirth of Radical Politics. In 2005, his blog, Lenin's Tomb, was named as the 21st most popular blog in the UK. His writing appears in the New York Times, the London Review of Books, The Guardian, Prospect, Jacobin, and innumerable other places, including his own Patreon. Richard completed his PhD in sociology at the London School of Economics under the supervision of Paul Gilroy. His new book, The Twittering Machine, was published by the Indigo Press in August 2019, which he will give a talk on today. You can learn more about Richard's work on his website, www.leninology.co.uk. So, Richard, it's great to have you with us here today, and whenever you're ready, we'll just get started.
Thank you for that really generous introduction. Okay, so I'm just going to go straight into this. I have written a lecture, and I'm just going to read straight through it. It can be a little bit boring, but just bear with me. You'll see where I'm going with it. Okay, starting remark. Everything I'm about to say is wrong. The Twittering machine isn't about hard drives and software. It's about writers and writing. An industrialized system of writing, in fact, the world's first ever mass, open-air, collective writing experiment that we're all participants in. A fairly strange system of writing, actually, because it's underwritten, as it were, by systems of digital writing that pay no heed to the phonetic or semantic properties of alphabetic writing. Everything we see on the internet, says Sandy Baldwin, is writing. Every file, every window, every app on every device is writing. As in the Matrix, the image that we see, even the image of letters and commas and full stops, is an ideal, abstract representation of far more complex systems of digital writing. Writing didn't begin with the alphabet, which represents the human voice. Not all writing is a congealment of the spoken word or the spoken thought. Writing began with knots and notches. Notched wood, quipos, knotted pieces of coloured string, which would be read with practiced motions of the hand like Braille. Before text, there was textiles. Many forms of writing have no reference whatsoever to the human voice. Seismographs, musical notation, circuit diagrams, knitting patterns. Now writing begins with noughts and ones. The computerization of capitalism has upended the traditional hierarchy of writing. In the past, there was a hierarchy of written authority beginning with a holy text, constitutions, Bibles, royal decree, and flowing down through the churches, education systems, the media, all the way down to the lowliest diarist or letter writer. Now we have a new constitution, one that no one was ever consulted about. It's written digitally, not alphabetically, and its writing doesn't represent voices, but automated human purposes. Every computer program, as Benjamin Britten writes, is a political program. Sorry, it's Benjamin Bratton. The anarchist collective Tikkun, next slide here, refers to the cybernetic hypothesis that human and machine behaviors are controlled by programmed and reprogrammable feedback loops. They say this is intrinsically political because it conceives of each individual behavior as something piloted in the last analysis by the need for the survival of a system that makes it possible and which it must contribute to. Now, the cybernetic constitution has looped us all into ever-expanded writing systems, and we are writing more than we ever had before in human history, at school, at work, in toilet breaks and work breaks, commutes, at parties. Abruptly scripturians, we are possessed by a violent desire to write. And what are we writing into being if not yet more digital images? To live in a world of digitally written images is to live in a simulacrum. We have birthed the world's most profitable industry, the social industry. Let's not dignify it by calling it social media. All media are social. All technologies are social. Who could object to something called social media? It's like calling cigarettes friendship sticks. They can be used in that way, but that's not what they're for. The social industry emerged out of a capitalist appropriation of the cyber left. Free stuff, conversation, low-cost association, even protest. How to make money out of that. Next slide. Before Twitter, there was TextMob. TextMob was an app created for activists protesting outside Democratic and Republican conventions in 2004. And in order to bypass the increasingly aggressive style of policing that they confronted, activists needed to decentralize their operations because their leaders would often get picked up by police. Communications personnel would get picked up by police. There would be mass arrests, sweeps as they were called. And they needed, in order to decentralize and avoid that kind of decapitation, a good communications infrastructure, one that wouldn't be jammed by police, one that would be so inconspicuous that organizers using it couldn't be spotted and arrested. The answer was to design an app that relies on an already successful, widely used mass technology, mobile phones and SMS texting, so that everyone who signed up to this app would receive texts from other users, updating them about the protest in real time, and they could go into different groups with different levels of privacy. They could share information about where the police were. They could share information about who had been injured and whether medical attention was needed. And if they were watching from afar, they could see the progress of the protest in real time. It wasn't until 2008 that the city's lawyers figured out how the activists had outflanked an intense police crackdown, and they began to issue subpoenas demanding the records of TextMob. By that time, however, one of TextMob's designers had moved to this small venture capital funded tech firm called Odeo. And in 2006, he and his colleagues had delivered a presentation for the bosses, and it was all about the success of TextMob. Shortly thereafter, the bosses brainstormed, and they had this idea for a really cool app, which, was like texting, but in public. Amazing. Twitter, as the name suggests, wasn't designed for activists, but to enable short bursts of meaningless communication. Tweets. Security. You don't have protection from police surveillance. Model of Twitter would be based on surveillance. However, apart from this, there was nothing to stop activists from using it to further their own objectives, provided they were cognizant of the exposed nature of the platform. So Twitter, as a result of this, was able to build its brand through mass movements. And the main way in which this happened was the invention, the coining of a slogan, the Twitter Revolutions, which was invented actually by State Department personnel. This was in the early days of the Obama administration. They were very close to Silicon Valley. They were very close to the bosses of these up-and-coming social media firms. And they believed that social media, if it spread globally, could be used to embarrass America's undemocratic rivals. There was, at that moment, a green movement taking place in Iran, and there was, obviously mass popular uprising following the election results, which were widely believed to have been faked or in some ways rigged. The State Department was in touch with Twitter because they were aware that some Iranian opposition activists were using it to get information out about the scale of repression, about the nature of the protests, and so on. And that Twitter was planning to have a bit of downtime. They were doing some engineering and so on. And State Department said to them, please don't shut it down. There is a Twitter revolution taking place in Iran. A bit of flattery there. But Twitter revolution became a phrase that was very popular. It was used during the Arab Spring, in the Tunisian uprising, the Egyptian uprising, and so on. And it, in the media and in advertising, social media became associated with progressive causes. So the industry, in a way, commodified radical desires and thrived, on the other hand, amid a crisis of sociality. I'll come back to the crisis of sociality, but the network emerged initially for the purposes of political activists during a stalemate for political organization, because at some ontological level, left-wing activists had deduced, organizations consist of networks. And it was hoped that by prioritizing networks of activists, networks of organization, this could be used to organize people horizontally, and it could substitute for traditional hierarchies, traditional parties, it could bypass civil society leaderships, and a new horizontalism could emerge around the idea of the network. And social media was an important part of that moment. And social media also offered to make up for the massive decline in social interactions that was measurable on several indices. I think I have some more slides on this. Right. I'm very sorry, I missed that slide. Yeah. Okay. So it also offered to make up for the massive decline in social interactions, measurable on several indices. You can see here in the slide some of the ways in which people have been interacting a lot less, certainly well before the plague. One of Twitter's founders suggested that where people felt alone, where they were in a crisis, where something bad had happened, an earthquake had struck, or something like that, or where they needed news or company or consolation, the network would be there, Twitter would be there. So in place of your community, in place of the old idea of a sort of a social community that you might be linked to, you had the online network. So the Twittering machine was also born just as neoliberal capitalism 1.0 entered a historic crisis. We recall it was initially a credit crunch, a crisis of the financial system. It quickly became a crisis of the wider system of production. It then mutated into a sovereign debt crisis where states were told that they would have to repay their debt to financial institutions, which had just caused a crisis. And that, of course, led to the crisis being passed on to taxpayers, welfare recipients, members of the public, in all sorts of other ways. So this was a crisis which was necessarily metabolized and transformed by states, by national states. And those national states, therefore, entered into a crisis of political authority, which was really only accelerated a long-term decline in trust in politicians and in national governments and so on. The Twittering machine accelerated that crisis of political authority. It destroyed the authority of journalists and the news media, and it sucked revenues out of the dying print empires. And it also, for the purposes of activists, ended the old one-way traffic of ideological meaning. In other words, it used to be the case if you went on a protest, you had to wonder whether maybe the Guardian would cover it and show a picture of a placard lying on its side somewhere, and not really give any sense of what the protest was about. Well, now you don't have to worry because it's going to be covered. It's going to be covered all over social media. That doesn't necessarily mean a lot of people will pay attention to it, but it will be covered. The information will be available. So that one-way traffic has ended. At the same time, just as capitalist crisis and the austerity projects that I mentioned meant a lot less communal stuff available and a lot less jobs available, the social industry offered an abundance of free stuff. So you could get TaskRabbit and Uber and Airbnb, and you can commodify every last bit of your spare time. You can commodify your spare room. You can make up for a lot of lost income if you can find new areas of your life to turn into a market niche. So much as digitalization created new production efficiencies, new globally integrated supply chains, much as the cybernetic offensive of capital dissolved traditional modes of mass working class organization by breaking them up and redistributing workforces across the world so that they could be organized virtually by digital networks. Much as digital labor improved the surveillance capacities of capital over both consumers and workers, much as digital technologies have created a more globally integrated vortex of capital integrated by finance capital, the real Geist or spirit of history. What does the industry ask in return for the conveniences that it offers? Because after all, as we all know, we're not its consumers. We don't pay the piper. We're not voters in a cyber democracy. It is neither a state nor a market. Well, they've told us again and again we are lab rats and wageless laborers. I think, just move on to the next slide here. Far more than Adorno's culture industry, the social industry integrates us from above. It programs our interactions with an invariant written formula. We have to sign up to certain protocols. We have to have ourselves a little description, have ourselves an image, a profile image, and we have to submit certain types of content within certain types of parameter. And we have to do it on the basis that we're competing for likes or shares or retweets or whatever. So there's a certain written formula that underlies every type of social interaction we can have on the social industry. And this produces, far more than the culture industry, new types of conformity, I would argue. And this is a strange new techno-political regime. It combines the surveillance powers of states, the market control of business empires, and the ideological power of mass media. It's more sophisticated even than mass media because it has no ideological agenda. It's in the reality shaping business. It doesn't care about what you think about the minimum wage or the war. If anything, those beliefs that you have can be quite useful to Twitter and Facebook. It can even be useful if you're a Holocaust denier or a Nazi or an MRA or a jihadist, because all of that stuff generates and draws audiences and attention, monetizable attention, and compels people to perform digital labor on the internet. So this, for the purposes of the industry, can be quite useful. So they don't really care what you believe in a sense. What they want to do is shape your reality. That works below the level of cognition, below the level of apprehension, below the level of ideology. It's sub-ideological. It's sub-hegemonic in Gramscian terms. And it reaches us on a level that is both highly massified and highly personalized. It bisects business and politics. It has no message, but it is profoundly ideological in this sense. And more vividly now than ever before, the medium itself is the message, and that message is always close by in our pockets. On the social industry, we have no rights, only incentives and controls. And the condition for our access to tools that seem to lubricate association and wayfinding is that we have to write constantly. Even when we're watching videos or scrolling or whatever it is we're doing, we are writing in the language of data. We're inscribing the system with our presence. And we can, of course, we have the option to write to anyone we like. We can write to celebrities, porn stars, jihadists, members of the royal family, politicians. We can hurl abuse at figures in authority. We can stalk our favorite celebrities. We can find out people that we used to know and find out what they're up to now. We can do all sorts of things. But really, when we're doing all this and indulging all these desires, which may include quite dark desires, we write to the machine. We confess our secrets to it. It takes a digital copy of the message and then passes it on to our intended recipient. What is our incentive, therefore, to participate in an industry like this? One answer that guilty social media bosses give, typically after they've stopped being social media bosses and have retired and moved on to other areas of profit, is addiction. They suggest that we're users much as heroin addicts are users. And yet the truth is, what is addiction? How can you be addicted to writing? Do we get a little dopamine buzz, as they believe, whenever we see the bright red notifications, which are like a clickbait headline? You won't believe what these 3 people have said about you. Well, this is how the social industry thinks. They think that we are chemically enslaved to the system. That we get the dopamine high that is, let's say, a hackable human weakness. We have a need for social validation, social approval, and that's a biochemical need, and the social industry administers it, and therefore we get addicted. We can't help it, and it makes us all sorts of crazy as a result. But you know, dopamine, first of all, the neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, I might have a slide about this. Let me just move next. Yes, here we go. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky will inform you that dopamine doesn't give you any kind of a high. It never has. It's linked to appetite and anticipation, to the pathways of wanting. In other words, addiction is something that is done with wanting by those who are done with wanting. It's what happens when something in your desire goes wrong, in a way. It could be regarded as a misplaced form of love. Certainly, addiction can be no more reduced to a chemical process than being in love. And if addiction is a form of love, it could be a form of being in love with, devoted to, addicted to, in the traditional etymological sense, the wrong things. And that could happen when the relationships in our lives disappoint us or don't work. Because if you think about alcohol, if you think about heroin, if you think about the things that people get addicted to and that destroy their lives, these are the things that one turns to get away from the disappointments of the world. And indeed, according to Sherry Turkle, that is exactly what we're doing with computers, with the internet. We're turning away from the disappointments of real human relationships. What, therefore, are we addicted to? They tell us we're addicted to their likes, the shares, the lure of online celebrity, because we all have to be micro-celebrities, on a machine where the goal is to cultivate a personal idol. You know, everything you say on there, everything you tweet or retweet, every like you chase, every communication you have on there is about building, in a way, a personal brand, a personal idol, an icon. Except that, perhaps like all celebrities, we are, on the social industry, constantly drawn to self-destructive auto-iconoclasm. You see it all the time. People engaging in meltdowns, people becoming hooked on the device just when it's being awful, just when people are being abusive, just when they have made a big mistake and said something terrible, and you know they end up getting themselves in a twist and destroying their reputation. You see celebrities do this on social media all the time. It somehow seems to be more compulsive when it's tearing us apart. And smokers and heroin addicts and gamblers and so on all know that addiction isn't all about pleasure. If you consider the Twittering machine to be a bit like a casino, where you roll the dice and await the verdict with every tweet, every status, every post, if you consider it to be a bit like that, One thing we know about gamblers is that they actively destroy their pleasure in gambling because they have to in order to tolerate the tremendous, horrible lows that come from having a big loss. In other words, to even out their emotions. So there's not really that much pleasure to be had in it, not directly. There's something else involved. And one thing we could say is that all of these people, in one way or another, and these people includes us, all of us, to the extent that we can be addicts, are all administering small doses of death every single day, with every last cigarette, or last drink, or last tweet. Another name for addiction is toxicomania. And the traditional idea of toxicity is there's no substance in the world that is intrinsically toxic. It's just a question of the correct quantities. Too much or too little. Generally speaking, too much. So there's a question of too muchness involved. But there's no evidence that the toxicity in question in our addiction is chemical. And if it is something that we as users are bringing to the table, as it were, because in some sense toxicity might be a human response rather than something that inheres in anything in the outside world, then we must find this toxicity somewhere beyond pleasure, beyond, as Freud put it, the pleasure principle in the death drive. We're hooked, it seems, on a barrage of information, the purpose of which is to goad us into further interaction. Every feed is a force feed. You only have to scroll briskly through your timelines to see one or two or three items that absolutely set you off for the rest of the day, that wind you up and get you back up and get your teeth grinding. And it could be that President Trump has said something stupid again. It could be that a friend of yours is behaving in a disappointing way. It could be that there's a worrying news item. Oh my God, COVID cases are on the rise again. People aren't wearing their masks. Oh, yada, yada. All of that stuff. And what do you do with that? What do you do with all that? Now that it's pushed this at you and infected you with that anxiety, and you could see it in a way as an anxiety-producing machine. Well, the only catharsis is to type. You write as hard as you can, as fast as you can, to express yourself, to be part of this expressive public sphere, to say what, in other words, you're giving testimony to the effect that the industry has just had on you. But you're expressing yourself. You're being part of a democracy, an online public sphere. At least that's the idea. Whereas in reality, as far as the industry is concerned, what you're doing is feeding it with plenty of data, the very same data that it will then use to further manipulate you and goad you into responding and writing more. So the only catharsis is to type, and that typing is exactly what will make you more anxious, depressed, hook you even further, and draw you in. So with the urge to write fast, and bear in mind, speed is of the essence here, because within a very short space of time, this thread that you're writing on may be forgotten. Or if you've been criticized for something and you have to respond to it, you better respond quickly because word gets around quickly. You have to nip it in the bud. Whatever it might be, the emphasis on writing fast. And with the incentive of a competitive like hunt, everybody's out there hunting the same likes as you, and with a culture formed by the values of hierarchy and status, and this I have a slide for. Oh, I had a slide for Death Drive, never mind. With a culture formed by the values of hierarchy, status, and competition that are worshipped by a handful of Northern Californian men who shape these devices, who devise them, what we type will, as often as not, be grandstanding, showboating, sadistic, backstabbing, trolling, facile, uninformed. Please follow me on Twitter. Because this is what happens when politically generative relationships and emotions are commodified. You'll see that on the slide here. I have a couple of quotes here from authors who have worked in the social industry or know it well. And one of the ways in which Alice Marwick's work operates is to, as you can see, she's the second quote there, investigate the cultures of status and hierarchy, which she believes are fairly neoliberal in the way that they operate in Northern California, and see how they operate among those who have been designing social media applications, and how that has shaped their view of what social life should be and how it should work. So I'll read out the quote. She says, studying the status structure of this Northern California tech community, the people who virtually built all the popular social media applications of the time would reveal a great deal about how status was built into Web 2.0 and thus illuminated how popular social software may promote inequality rather than counter it. Well, it's hard to look at the social industry and the way it regulates our interactions and not see that it is driving us, first of all, obviously in a highly individualistic direction, or let us say, more precisely, in an entrepreneurial direction, because an account isn't an individual, it is an enterprise, like a corporation, like a small business, like your online gambling account, or anything else like that. So it's a system whereby you put into circulation some form of capital, which you're seeking a return on. That's one way to look at this. Well, it's also a competitive system because everybody is hunting for the same relatively scarce attention. It is subject to scarcity. And it's also a status-oriented system because, of course, it generates its ecology of micro-celebrities and macro-celebrities and so on, some of whom are able to monetize and become big stars. And the ones who become really big stars then also become celebrities in mainstream media and so on. Everybody ends up talking about them. And you can make an incredible amount of money from this system if you just ask those who have become YouTube celebrities or Instagram celebrities. So this is what happens, as I say, when politically generative relationships and emotions are commodified. So what are we devoted to here? What are we addicted to? In a way, we're addicted to a furnace of meaning, where the somatic onslaughts of information never select for accuracy. They don't select for accuracy because their point is to hit you on a gut level. Their point is not to inform you or even persuade you. Their point is not to entertain you as such. Their point is to have a somatic impact on you so that you keep doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is to feed the machine with data so that advertisers can buy appropriate advertising, sort of very, let us say, very precise advertising space, very precise, demographically informed, data-informed advertising space. And not just advertising space, as Jaron Lanier points out, it's real-time manipulation that they're paying for. So this information doesn't just try to inform, it doesn't select for accuracy, it selects for whatever will goad you into behaving in the way that they want. And on the basis of their behaviorist perspective, they think that it's a system of intermittent rewards. Intermittent rewards is a very telling term because the implication is that if you got your rewards reliably, like a wage packet, it would become less effective, less boring, less interesting. It would become more boring. Whereas if you get intermittent rewards that just come when they come, it can't be, maybe one day you log into your Facebook account and you see that a whole bunch of people have started liking your photographs and telling you how awesome you are. Well, great, that has a wonderful effect for a moment, But if that was happening every day, it wouldn't be so effective. So it has to be intermittent. But there also has to be what Jaron Lanier calls carrot and stick, by which he means the positive reinforcements have to be accompanied by some negative reinforcement, something awful, some sort of attack, some sort of negative feedback, something that makes you feel dreadful, something that stresses you out. So that's part of the system of addiction, which brings us back to the whole question of the death drive. We can go back to the last slide for that, I think. Because if it's an integral to the whole system of information, that what you're getting out of it is not just the sort of so-called dopamine high, the stuff that makes you feel good about yourself for a few seconds, but the storms of disapproval, the hate, the moments of self-destruction, the rage, the depression. Let's suppose on the social industry you're subject to sexism on a daily basis or racism on a daily basis. And let's say that it drives you mad. Let's say that it makes you want to reply to everybody who is behaving in this way to you and to call them out and show them up to everybody. Well, that may make you very unhappy. It may make you depressed. It may make you miserable. It may make you stressed out. But according to the machine, because their data doesn't work on the basis of how you're feeling, their data works on the basis of whether you're interacting, the machine will say you love it. The machine will say you're enjoying it immensely. In other words, they don't believe in your ability to articulate a personal, let us say, opinion about anything. They don't trust your ability to know what you really want. They trust in the beta testing. And if the beta testing shows that you will engage more with the machine on the basis of certain innovations, that's all they care about. It's another way in which it has nothing to do with, let us say, informing you, or nothing to do with an online cyber democracy. So we're devoted to this somatic onslaught of information, a volatile combination of a stock market of sentiments, a 24-hour news system, a neighborhood watch, dominated by the same network of media firms, politicians, marketing and PR agencies, corporations, micro-celebrities and macro-celebrities who, in fact, make up most of the traffic. I should have mentioned their sock puppets and, online trolls, because practically half of online traffic, it depends on the estimate that you're reading, but about half of online traffic is made up of these sock puppets, trolls and bots and what have you. And most nation states, or at least many, many dozens of them that we're aware of, involve or use online troll armies, which also means that you can never tell whether you're being trolled, and you can never tell whether you're being subject to some sort of bot operation, or whether you're inadvertently and unknowingly a conscript in somebody else's cyber war. They talk of freedom of information as the ultimate time. That's something they say can always be remedied by more good speech. So the answer is freedom of speech, freedom of information. But the truth is that information is never free. It is a system of controls and surveillance. Freedom of information or speech is the industry's code for its monopoly over its content, which must never be challenged by users or regulators. If you want examples of this, look at what happens when social industry platforms are faced with criticism, such as, for example, Reddit faced when it was criticized for distributing images, nudes of celebrities, unwanted nudes and so on, leaked celebrity nudes. Their argument was that ultimately they're protecting a space of free speech. But the reality is that these data bundles that they produced, these industries that they've helped build up, they belong to them. They don't believe that it's the right of regulators, of the security state necessarily, of certainly a democratic public, or the users to infringe on their control over their information. So freedom of information or speech is the industry's code for its monopoly over its content. The mass production of information that is linked to this, which is bigger now than in recent years, than ever before in human history. More data is now produced on an annual basis than has been produced historically. This makes the world, in some ways, more enigmatic, not less. More difficult to follow, not less. Information is, after all, revenge porn, doxing, Tommy Robinson videos, QAnon conspiracy theories, or hashtag Pizzagate. Information is online communities of would-be citizen journalists who are going through a crisis of knowing, a crisis of meaning, who don't believe they can trust any legitimate authorized source of knowledge anymore, and who are trying to reconstruct something out of that crash in meaning. And so you saw this with the 9/11 truth communities. What united them was not what they agreed had happened on 9/11. What united them was what they agreed hadn't happened. In other words, that what hadn't happened was a bunch of trained jihadists had taken control of a number of aircrafts and used it to inflict material damage on sites of American power with considerable civilian casualties built into the whole attack. That, they said, had not happened. It didn't make sense. The story fell apart upon looking at it. It was just too, at a baseline point of view, uncanny. It didn't seem real. It seemed like a movie. And so therefore, something must be wrong. They must be lying to us. They must have done something. They must have staged the attack. They must have used explosives in World Trade Center 7. Some people said they must have used a nuclear weapon, all that sort of stuff. All these implausible theories united only by what they agree hasn't happened. And again, you find that the implausible, credulous narratives that emerge around conspiracy theories derive in the first instance from disbelief, from radical doubt, from a sense that there's something in the, what Lacanians would call the symbolic order, the structure of things, how things appear, that no longer makes sense. So information, in this sense, is necrotic. Information is, after all, what's etched on your headstone, and also the stars over your grave. So I'm going to move on to the next section. There is a well-known relationship between the use of the social industry and depression. It's not clear exactly what the relationship is, but study after study suggests that time on the industry is correlated to increased depression, self-harm, and suicidal behavior. I've cited a couple of examples, a few examples on this slide here. In the book I link many, many more. But by and large, what is found is that increased use, increased screen time associated with these platforms is correlated with increased propensity to self-harm, to be depressed, to be suicidal, even potentially to engage in suicidal behavior. A correlation is not a cause. To establish a correlation is not to establish that one thing caused the other. They might both be correlated for reasons that are not visible. They might both be correlated because they both arise in a similar context, producing depressive outcomes. That is entirely possible. It might be that factors in the lives of young people who are now using the social industry, now using Instagram and Snapchat to share images of themselves, that something in their lives has become objectively worse than what was available before. It might be that their future looks a lot more grim and bleak than that of their forebears. Certainly there appears to be something in that. So if we weren't already more depressed than we've been for a very long time, and global evidence suggests that we are, would the social industry, be our remedy? Would the red pill be the powerful antidepressant that it so palpably is for so many young white men? What set fascism in motion yesterday, Felix Guattari warned in his rebuttal of post-war triumphalism, continues to proliferate in other forms within the complex of contemporary social space. Microfascisms was a term that Deleuze and Guattari coined to describe that proliferation, the circulation of fascistic possibilities that eluded detection on the macro level and that took place within a liberal and democratic society. Microfascism, the circulation of racist or misogynistic memes, swarms of resentful sentiment, id streams of misogynistic and homophobic infotainment, riveting attention for the social industry and monetizing depression for a new generation of far-right micro-celebrities. I mention a few of them in this slide. Stefan Molyneux, who made £1 million worth of Bitcoin donations from various platforms over a 5-year period. Tommy Robinson, who, and this is my own mathematics here, by the way, Tommy Robinson's single most watched YouTube video alone would have yielded $15,200. That's just based on the rate at which you get paid by YouTube for viewership. Alex Jones made $5 million in 2014 alone, primarily through the platform-based advertising and sale of his various male supplements, which I think is a not uninteresting phenomenon in the age of MRAs. And, of course, Donald Trump himself in 2017, it was estimated that Trump, thanks to the flows of attention that he generates every time he opens his mouth, and thanks to the storms of approval and disapproval, the likes and shares and all the rest of it, he alone was worth $2 billion to Twitter, a fifth of its total value. And you wonder why Twitter doesn't want to delete racists and white supremacists and sexists and homophobes and neo-Nazis and white nationalists and Holocaust deniers and all the rest of it. It's money. Fascist YouTube, according to one estimate, makes twice as much money from the super chat function as equivalent accounts on the left. Of course, some of you may not know what the super chat function is, but if you ever tune in to watch a live YouTube stream involving fascist micro-celebrity, you'll see that essentially it involves, on the one hand, of course, a parasocial celebrity relationship with whoever is hosting the podcast quite often, but also there's a certain kind of dubious enjoyment in donating itself, because people can give money so that, for example, $14.88 or something like that, so that it will recall the sort of coded messages or symbols of the far-right neo-Nazi movement. I think 1/8, of course, is code for Adolf Hitler's initials. So if you donate a sum with 18 cents on the end, you're recalling and celebrating Adolf Hitler. There's a whole series of, and of course, if you donate $14.18, well, you mentioned the 14 words of white supremacist discourse and celebrated Adolf Hitler at the same time. So there's a certain kind of identity-forming enjoyment that can be involved in this kind of donation. But it's also worth asking why the far right generates so much more money than other tendencies on YouTube. It may be a question of what is so riveting about this content. It may be a question of, are the people who are participating in these live streams and these super chats more likely to view social interaction through the exchange of money, which is what psychoanalysis would expect, actually. Or it may be a question of, is there something just intrinsically addictive and appealing about fascistic content? Is there, in some sense, as some post-war writers suspected, a fascist in all of us? What's happening here is that these micro-fascist propensities and far-right micro-celebrities and their circulation and augmentation on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and so on, they together collectively form a resonance machine. The social industry and the far right, each making the other more profitable, each enfolding its logic into the other. So the social industry doesn't set out to promote the far right. It doesn't have any particular bias towards the far right. If the algorithms just happen to promote the far right, as The Guardian and various other sources allege, and if you watch the documentary The Social Dilemma, it makes the same allegation based on input from former employees of the social industry. Well, we can blame the algorithms, but what we might reasonably wonder is supposed to be so addictive, so riveting about a 3-hour-long Prison Planet rant about libtards. What is so thrilling about this extreme content, unless it is cognate with extreme sport? Because the point is here, we start off somewhere, according to this story of online radicalization, we start somewhere like, let's say I look up a video of Donald Trump or a mainstream conservative author of some sort. According to this story, the algorithms, the watch next function, will lead me inexorably along the rails of a path of radicalization towards Holocaust denial, neo-Nazi material, MRA stuff, lone wolf content. Well, in a way, it could be that by putting it up next, it just relieves the guilt. You don't have to go out looking for it. You don't have to search for it. It was just there. It was just right in front of you. And maybe you thought, okay, well, I'll just have a look. Think about the Finsbury Park killer. Let me come back to him. The Finsbury Park killer, Darren Osborne, was somebody who was depressed, who was alcoholic, who was suicidal. I mean, he had attempted suicide. And one day he watched a docudrama about grooming gangs on the BBC, I think. And that docudrama was not a program about Muslims. It was a program about child sex offenders. But Darren Osborne, conditioned by a society in which Muslims have been regularly used as a punchbag by the tabloids and the press and politicians for a long time, inferred that the issue was Muslims, that there was something wrong with Muslims. And so he started to search for this sort of content, and he found Tommy Robinson's videos. And it took 3 weeks from when he saw this documentary to his consumption of this Tommy Robinson material, videos and posts and all the rest of it, until he decided that he was a soldier in a war against Islam and that he wanted to kill all Muslims. He was psychically primed for genocide. So that's what the extreme sport was like for him. It was a cure for his depression because it told him what was wrong in his life and what was meaningful in society and what was worth fighting for and what he could do, and that he was not alone, and that other people felt the same way as he did. And if you've seen Adam Ramsey on Open Democracy, who spent a long time infiltrating far-right circles, he describes a similar pattern of far-right politics working for these men, young men, as an antidepressant. Well, somehow the social industry puts to work our paranoia, our fantasies of restitution and revenge, our desire for domination, the authoritarian need to be right, our capacity to humiliate others, our approval-seeking in-group conformity, and our obverse tendencies towards malice and social sadism. All of these tendencies are, of course, just part of the quiddity of late capitalist life, and they're not particular to any political tendency. You see them on the left, I certainly do. But they might be considered ordinary fascist jouissances. I'm using Lacan's term. Jouissance just means a form of enjoyment that is, let's say, below the level of consciousness in terms of how it works, but it's nonetheless quite riveting and addictive. We go on the machine ostensibly because we're lonely and depressed, we're isolated, and it offers us an addictive remedy which makes us more lonely and depressed or ends in carnage. The social industry is a chronopage. Chronopage is the term for a monster that eats time. If you ever go to Cambridge, you can visit the Corpus clock. And that clock, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, involves a monster sitting on top of a wheel, turning the wheel, and snapping its jaws open and shut to consume each second. So that's the monster that eats time. An industry that monetizes time on device, as the gambling industry calls it, replaces the tick of the clock with key clicks and thumb taps. A near-death experience, measuring out its approach, tap, tap, tap. The temporal experience of the social industry is very different from clock time. In casinos and pubs, the signs of the passing of time are blocked to keep you there, so that you don't know that it's daytime or nighttime. They obscure the windows, they tint the windows, or they conceal the windows entirely. In casinos, they don't put clocks up anywhere, and they have a constant flow of food and refreshments and snacks and beverages, so that you're never thinking, oh my God, is it dinner time? No, it's always there, and it's always the same. So you get stuck in what they call the machines flow, the machine zone. The social industry absorbs you into the machine zone. This is Natalie Dow-Schul, her work on machine gambling. She innovated this phrase to describe how people on digital gambling machines, and it is disproportionately women these days, whereas it used to be men in the past, get sucked into this state of just a different feeling of time, where all the other stuff in their life and all the other schedules that they're living by disappear. This is a state that's akin to the ticker trance that stock market junkies used to fall into. They'd be watching the ticker tape come out of the machine, telling them what the stock markets were saying and what was worth what. And they would just become absorbed in this constant flow and lose track of everything else. The industry notably doesn't give you the time. It gives you the age of each post. You'll see that on most platforms, which is not the time, but it is information about the state of the game so that you can roll the dice. It's also a temporality that somehow is always intensifying. It's always cresting towards culminations. You see this if you go on, for example, Twitter. Almost every day there's some issue that people are getting worked up about, cresting towards a sort of climax over. There's a feeling of sort of a group feeling that we're all heading somewhere, that we're all going to do something about this. This celebrity did something wrong. J.K. Rowling said something bad, or whatever it happens to be today. Whatever trivial, nonsensical, idiotic bullshit that people get fixated on, it contributes to this sensation of time speeding up and intensifying. J.M. Berger, who is a security intellectual, writes in the context of ISIS and the way it used social media for its radicalization and recruitment strategies. He talks about the social industry as a carrier for millennial contagion, because time on the social industry, as he almost recognizes but doesn't quite, is apocalyptic time. Apocalyptic time is when time contracts. It's kairotic time, as theologists would say. It's when one experiences things happening more and more frequently, more and more close together, everything condensing and darkening, when everybody seems to be going through the same thing. So there's some sort of contagion afoot. Everybody seems to be experiencing something similar. And so there's the pace of events, there's the experience of everybody going through something similar, and there's the idea that there will be a culmination any moment now. That is apocalyptic time. If life is defined by what we attend to, the attention economy turns life into raw material for extraction. This is what this slide is about. It drills into our lunch hours, our tube journeys, our gatherings, even sex. Some averages. I used to use this statistic, 135 minutes a day. In a lifespan of 71 years, that's 50,000 hours. Turns out that's now out of date. In 2019, it was estimated that the average global internet user spent 153 minutes per day on the social industry. That's before the plague. I have no idea what it would be like now that people are far more reliant on these platforms in order to conduct their social interactions. But last year, it was 153 minutes. In the average global lifespan of 71 years, that is over 66,000 hours. Now, obviously, I don't want you to take that figure very seriously. It's just a way to get a sense of scale. That's an enormous part of your life that is given over to these devices. And this is how it happens. Addictions happen behind our backs in small decisions. I'll just have this one drink. I'll just have this one smoke. I'll just answer this one tweet. Tap, tap, tap. That's your life disappearing. Tap, tap, tap. We don't have to do this. So we're entitled to ask the minimal utopian question, what else could we be doing if not this? That's the lecture. I'd like to take questions if you have any.
So we've got plenty of questions here we can get through. The first one is from Bea, and she's asked, What are your thoughts on the effects of social media on cancel culture?
Well, it depends what we mean by cancel culture. There's a right-wing sort of meme according to which cancel culture is any expression of anti-racist thought, any expression of hostility to misogyny or homophobia or transphobia or whatever. Now, that said, I described earlier some of the passions that flow on the social industry on both left and right, in different ways, obviously. The sort of sadistic passions, the passions to bring somebody down, to bring down this celebrity. You know, there's a well-known phenomenon with regard to celebrities whereby people forge passionate love-hate relationships with them. They love them for a long time, but when they get brought down, they dance on their graves. And I remember that happening in a few cases. I don't want to talk about specifics here, but I've seen that happen to a few people who are trashed most fervently by their fans, by the people who supposedly love them. And that tells you something about how this stuff works. Now, what is going on with cancel culture, obviously, is that it's part of a more general tendency for people to find virtuous reasons to enjoy aggression and sadism and so on. Now, you can do this in two ways. One is you can be a troll. And therefore, if you're a troll, you pretend not to have any moral agenda. Or you can be a vigilante, what you might call in some contexts a witch hunter. A vigilante pretends that they do have a moral agenda. They're both quite similar, and they're both part of the same sort of spiral. Because you know how it is, a troll will come out and say something awful, deliberately awful, to get you riled up. And the vigilante will try and get you, if you say something the least bit wrong, you know, they'll try and shut you down. Well, think about this in psychoanalytic terms. That's something that's going on in our heads all the time. There's always this battle between, on the one hand, the sort of the inner troll, the id, if you like. I'm using these terms crudely here, okay? We could make it more sophisticated, but just for the sake of concision, you know, like there's the internal troll, and that troll is the figure within that's always causing you to sort of blurt out things that you didn't mean to say, or tripping you up, or causing you to make mistakes, or causing you to get caught doing things that you thought you were going to get away with. All of that stuff. Whereas the internal vigilante is, of course, the superego, which is constantly irrationally aggressive and accusing you of things that, you know, you have never done or wouldn't do or whatever, but nonetheless, it's just constant. That voice is constant. So that on the social industry, if you are called out, as it were, the temptation is, because you're always accusing yourself all the time, the temptation is to confess and to plead for redemption and you see how celebrities and people who are called out do this all the time. They grovel. They belittle themselves. This isn't me. I hope you'll understand. This really wasn't me. I made this mistake. I made this terrible mistake. I made this tweet yesterday. Please forgive me. And of course, it's never enough. It's never good enough. It's always more proof that you're absolute trash, that you deserve, you know, that your apology is fake. Anybody who believes it is a complete dupe, etc., etc. So those are the volatile dynamics. Now, if we can account for that without getting sucked into that idea that every expression of, like, let's say we take down this statue of a slaver, is that cancel culture? I don't think so. I don't think we want to go down that road. So we have to be very careful with this language.
Yeah, that's super interesting. You touched on it there briefly. I'm just curious about this tendency people have about sort of raising a celebrity up and holding them in like super high regard, and then whenever that person gets taken down, like just like sort of jumping on their grave a bit. From your research into psychoanalysis, have you discovered anything that might suggest why we do that? Why we have this tendency?
You know, let me just have a look at my. Got a copy of my book here. I'm just going to have a look here because I remember looking into this, and what was fascinating was that there was even a syndrome associated with this. And it's not, this isn't something that psychoanalysis had discovered, but there is a syndrome wherein people become fixated on celebrities and then also seek to bring them down. Let me see. So, let me see if I can find the reference, because I want to be as precise as possible about this. Celebrity worship syndrome, that's what it is. And, it's the I'm your number one fan thing. You could look at this in a number of ways. I mean, it depends on whether you think celebrity worship syndrome is a manifestation of psychosis or something like that. Well, I don't necessarily think it is, but you could think about the ways in which we all look at and idealize figures in our lives, even if we don't know them and have never met them. Indeed, the fact that we haven't met them is a good reason why we can get away with idealizing them, because if we meet people, then we recognize, okay, they have their flaws like anybody else. Well, in a way, you could call that kind of idealization a form of cruel optimism, because it sets the standards for their behavior, their life, unrealistically high. But if we are looking for somebody to idealize and model the best part of ourselves on, you can see why that's tempting. But it's intrinsically punitive as an idea. I think somebody, maybe it was Francis Spufford, said we need to have a sense of kindly pessimism. This kind pessimism would recognize that human beings are, as the sort of Greek tragic plays show us, intrinsically flawed, driven by hubris, spite, ego, all sorts of stuff, and that it's unfair to idealize anybody, because it will just hasten their downfall. There's another side of this, which is what's going on psychologically with celebrity. And in chapter 2, I deal with some of the cases of people either committing suicide as a result of their online celebrity and the effects it's had on them, or committing what's called digital suicide, which is, in my view, a far healthier option, because it involves smashing the idol. Because what happens with celebrities is that they become associated with an image, an idol, an icon that's far bigger than they are, and is a distorted version of them, and is far purer than they are, and is sexier than they are, and is more psychologically secure than they are. Again and again, you have the celebrity meltdown, and it's been documented so many times. The celebrity meltdown, which is a sort of a way of letting the world know that this image is absolutely crushing me. I am driven to despair by this image, because I can't live up to it. It's too much. And I'm constantly being, how when you look at like Heat magazine and similar publications, there's quite often like photo shoots and so on of celebrities with like their makeup melting, or their plastic surgery gone wrong, or they've got their legs apart in the taxi, or whatever it is, something to show the sort of like, to see where the image falls apart and you see the horrible reality. Celebrities are being exposed to that all the time, so they're always being found wanting. They're always being subject to this irrational superego sort of punishment. So it's a two-sided thing. But yeah, and the thing about this is, what's worrying about this, I mean, if it was a small group of celebrities, you could say that maybe we're like a cult, maybe we need to sacrifice a few people every year, so that the grain will grow and, we can have plentiful harvests or whatever. But, we're all celebrities now. That's the whole point. Everybody is growing up, who's growing up now in this industry, is growing up with the idea that they are a celebrity, that they have an online public relations account, and that they have an image to protect. And that means that we're all tangled up in those dynamics. And that's incredibly volatile, and one that's quite cruel for many, many people.
That's fascinating. So is it sort of like if we hold a celebrity in high regard and really like idealize them, then that kind of becomes like we kind of set those sort of idealistic standards for ourselves. But then that's very, very hard to live up to. So then whenever we see a flaw in that person and this person then gets taken down, then that like kind of like takes the pressure off us. And then that's why we like to sort of tramp on them so much, because then we can just think, well, they're not perfect, so I don't have to be. And is that kind of the way of thinking here, or am I way off?
No, I mean, I think that's one way it can work out. I mean, I don't think we should these are what I'm suggesting are just some coordinates, some ways of like approaching the subject, but how it works out in practice, it's kind of different from case to case. But my guess is, yeah, you're right. There's something connected about the way in which people idealize others and attempt to idealize themselves. And since we're all celebrities on the social industry, we all have to idealize ourselves. You know, like the selfies you put out and your profile pictures, they're always too perfect, too happy, you know. You always look too hot. And in real life, you know, people meet you and, oh, really? And, you know, your dinners look too nice and your holidays look too fun and your children are too cute and your cat is too gorgeous and all of this stuff, you know, like, because you only put those parts of life that will accommodate themselves to a marketing-driven idea of life as constant fun and enjoyment, you know, and most of life isn't that. Most of life is difficulty and struggle, you know, in one form or another, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Difficulty can be fulfilling in some ways, but we don't have a language for accommodating that. We have a language for happiness, achievement, ecstatic fun, you know, which is the image that we have to project on this industry. Well, that's another thing. Psychoanalysts will tell you that one thing is driving people absolutely mad and making them really miserable and depressed and as they come into their, you know, chambers or whatever, the analytic cell, is that the expectation that they're supposed to be happy. You know, they come in and go, why am I not happy? Everybody else is happy. Why am I not? And like, you know, most people aren't happy most of the time. Happiness is a contingent state. It's not a goal, you know. It's vastly overestimated as something that we should aim for. But the idea that everybody has to be happy and competitively happy, you know, I'm more happy than you are because I've got a great job and I've got a great car and yada, yada, all that stuff, all that strutting and preening that we have to engage in. When people say, I'm not really that happy, and in fact, quite often I'm not very happy at all, I'm miserable. Sometimes the right thing to say to them is, look, the world is such that it's appropriate to be miserable sometimes. You know, if you lose something, it's appropriate to grieve. If you suffer, you know, if you're made unemployed, it's appropriate to be unhappy about that. There's nothing pathological about this, and you don't have to feel guilty about it. So that's another aspect of, I suspect, what is catalyzing people's feeling of depression online. Again, I'm not saying that social media causes depression that didn't already exist. I'm saying it intensifies it and magnifies it, making it worse than it was, in order that it can be, you know, quite, you know, almost as a byproduct, but it can be commodified, it can be monetized, it can be turned to profit.
Yeah. Ruby Wax, she does a lot of work for, like, she does like a mental health campaigner at the minute, and in her new book, she talks about we need a new social network. Instead of Twitter, she wants to call it Shitter, and it's just where everybody posts their worst and lowest moments, and that's the only content that's allowed on there. I don't think she's serious, but I think it's an interesting idea. So next question here is from Maya, and she's just curious about your own, like, given everything that you know about this industry, what does your own relationship with social media look like? Like, are you on these platforms? Do you have any habits around them? Like, how do you personally engage with social media?
Well, like probably most people, I have a love-hate relationship with it. I had this fantasy that when I wrote this book, having written it and published it and promoted it and so on, I'd be like, well, now I can leave social media alone. But then it occurred to me, Richard, you're a self-employed author. That's how you make your money, and nobody's going to promote your stuff for you. I mean, I have an agent, but that's not the same thing. Like on a day-to-day basis, how do I get people to be interested in what I'm writing? How do I get them to help me pay the bills, essentially? This was what it's about. That means that I'm dependent on these platforms, like every sort of neoliberal subject. And that's becoming more and more a thing, I think. That's going to become, especially as a result of the plague, I think more people are going to become dependent on these devices. So this is another aspect of addiction that I talk about in, I think, chapter 1, or is it chapter 2? I can't remember. But where I talk about the fact that addiction can be quite logical, not just pathological, in as much as if you build a society around these forms of platforms, if you build a society around surveillance capitalism, as it were, then of course you become dependent on, let's say, I mean, if you live in London and you want to get about, particularly during the plague, you're not going to take a bus. You're going to take Uber. You're going to use Uber. If you're, we all know how terrible Uber is in various ways, but the point is, what are the alternatives? And if you think about the smart cities that are being innovated by Google and by the Chinese state and various other places, you heard about this, right? Where they're essentially building cities around essentially augmented reality systems, data chips, processors, and so on, which will be distributed everywhere so that the city itself can constantly react to and modify its own conditions. It can react to weather, it can react to the traffic, it can change the way the city operates, the flows of traffic, the protection from the weather, it can regulate flows of pedestrians, all of that sort of stuff. Well, that is Gilles Deleuze, I think it was, maybe it was Guattari actually, but innovated the idea of the society of control. And the society of control is different from what Foucault would have called a disciplinary society. A disciplinary society is one where power operates through sort of apparatuses and institutions that uphold norms. And those norms can be quite good norms, like caring, looking after you. But they can also be punitive and so on. But the point is that they're disciplinary in as much as they come with incentives and disincentives and so on, backed up by norms. Okay, well, that's how modern capitalism has worked for most of its history. The society of control is different. The society of control is just, nobody's telling you what's good or bad. Nobody's telling you what's right or wrong. But rather, you will have so many options. And if you do X, you will have these options. And if you do Y, you'll have the other options. For example, your credit, the availability of credit to you will depend on your credit rating. It'll depend on a series of data-driven factors. It'll depend on a credit report and how that's compiled. So that's how increasing areas of life are being governed by, the data that is accumulated about you. So nobody tells you what's right or wrong. They just fix your behavior within an acceptable bandwidth. Mm. And you will be encouraged in certain directions and discouraged in other directions. Well, that's what the Chinese state has been doing. And it was doing this well before COVID-19, like the idea that essentially, what did they have? Something called, I think it was called social credit, where essentially, your behavior and movements and so on could be tracked, and what you purchased could be tracked, and good behavior would give you more credit, and bad and unpatriotic behavior would give you less credit, and so on. So if they're trying to, for example, if they're trying to discourage people from smoking, well, okay, if you buy a pack of cigarettes, then you'll have less credit, that kind of thing. So that's a system of control where in the Chinese case, it merges the sort of disciplinary society with the society of control, because there's norms backing up what they're doing. But more complicatedly and more worrying in a way is when the control slips into the background. Nobody argues for it. Nobody argues over it. It just happens. It just emerges. And that's what's already been taking place. Like, you know, when Cathy O'Neill says that algorithms are opinions embedded in code, whose opinions? Whose opinions are structuring our social life? Whose opinions are we addicted to in this sense? Not ours. We didn't have any say in this. So there's a wider sense in which we can become logically addicted to a set of apparatuses and so on. And certainly I'm not immune from this, and I don't believe it's possible to, as it were, put the toothpaste back in the tube. But what I would like us to do is to think about ways in which we could take control of these media. And one way in which we can think about that is to look at how it's been done differently. I talk about the Minitel system in France. Have you heard about this?
No.
Oh, right. Well, you all should know about Minitel because it's fascinating. This is the internet before the internet. And it didn't have, first of all, it was run by the public sector, right? And the terminuses, the terminals, the computers were basically provided free of charge by your local authority. You would go down, pick up a Minitel computer. It was a small wooden box. Front would flip out. It would have a little keyboard and a little screen. From that, you could go online and, say, read a newspaper, check your bank balance, regulate temperature and lighting in your house, engage in online forums, and so on. It actually, and there was sex work as well. It actually looked a lot like the internet as we know it in many ways, and it had some of the dark sides. I mean, there's a former Minitel sex worker who was being interviewed on Reply All recently, a podcast, and he basically was describing how, as part of his work, he was really overworked. He had to maintain separate accounts and answer different people all at the same time. So he was pretending to be 6 different women at one and the same time for all of these customers. He was being massively overworked. That's that's just capitalism. That's just how it works. If there's money to be made, somebody's got to produce it. Okay, but there was also a lot less of what we now see as the flaws of the internet, like trolling and fake news and all of that stuff. There certainly was a lot more of what the cyber left was hoping for from the internet. Because if you look at the way in which Minitel was used by students to organize against, say, student fees and things like that, changes to education policy, the ways in which nurses organized on Minitel to, say, build up their strike against the government, which they did successfully. If you look at the ways in which the post-68 left, Felix Guattari was one of them, sort of oriented towards these media systems, they could see that there was, it didn't have the same competitive, individualist, and hierarchical, status-oriented ethos. It was actually potentially, despite the fact that it was all state-run and, you can't trust the state necessarily any more than you can trust the market, but it was in principle in the public sector, and there was an ethos of participation. Everybody could be involved, as long as you could pay your fee, basically. So you would get the terminals for free, and you would pay per use. And if you wanted to set up an online service like a website, their equivalent, you would pay a small fee. That was it. Pretty democratic as these things go.
And was this the 90s or the 80s? When was this in place?
It was formally launched in the early 1980s, and it was devised and developed through the 70s. They were going to use a system that was quite similar to the internet, the way the internet set up, sort of TCP, IP, and so on. But they used something else, and essentially involved using your phone line and so on. Well, that was very successful. It was widely popular. It obviously didn't have the global success of the internet, but it did involve millions of French people. It was a very nationally based system, obviously. There was a moment in which they tried to globalize it, and the organizers of Minitel went to Silicon Valley and spoke to various entrepreneurs there. But really, they tried to sell it as something it wasn't, as a commercial service. And as such, they couldn't compete with the existing services that were already there. And at that stage, catering to very small, nerdy, wealthy communities in California and elsewhere, and also to university systems and so on. So they never took off globally. Otherwise, history might have been different. And to be honest, because it was the public sector, and because interest waxed and waned, and because the World Wide Web exploded and became so popular, it sort of was neglected. It wasn't really. I mean, it was very popular for the length of time that it was in duration. It was efficient enough, but there was no real. There wasn't enough investment in it. I mean, it's different from something like, for example, the BBC, which is a public sector thing, funded by the public, and there's always constant in investment going on and innovation. This was kind of left to rot, so it was unable to compete with the World Wide Web. But what I'm suggesting here is that actually these technologies do belong to the general public. They were innovated in the public sphere. Even the World Wide Web and its technologies obviously originate from the Defense Department and various sort of government agencies that develop most of these technologies. And that holds even for some of the most high technology aspects of it. Apple wouldn't exist as a corporation today if it wasn't for the Department of Defense handing it technical innovations, technologies that were then used to make the iPod and the iPad and so on, so that the world's giants that dominate the globe today have basically been created by the public sector. This has taken me somewhat away from the original focus, which is, what's my relationship to it? Well, like everybody else, I'm just plugged in there. I'm addicted to it in both the psychoanalytic sense and the broader economic sense. And what I'm trying to figure out is how to, deal with it in the ways that I need to deal with it without being psychologically hooked in, without being goaded into responding to negative comments, or without feeling that I have to check Twitter to satisfy my sense of anxiety or whatever else. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, I'm curious, if you were advising companies like YouTube and Twitter and maybe Facebook as well, and how would you advise them to approach things like regulating content on their platforms? Like, say someone is like promoting hate speech or racism or whatever. How would you advise them to regulate that? And at what point do you draw the line? Is there? Yeah, could you maybe expand upon that?
Yeah, sure. Can you just allow me? I need to plug my
no problem.
So I'm going to change position here so that I don't run out of energy and I can continue to talk to you. Well, there's a number of things to be argued about here. Number one, the current way of doing this is what they call community standards, right? Well, that's a lie, because there's no community involved in developing these standards. This is just corporate techno speak. Describe quite loose and often incoherent and inconsistent policies, with regard to what constitutes hate speech, what constitutes safety, and all the rest of it. And the result of that is that underpaid workers in, say, Egypt or Morocco or wherever are being put to work monitoring this content and interpreting these rules. And the result is the chaos that you would expect. You see quite a lot of stuff that is blatantly racist, sexist, even threats of violence and whatever else, that are just, they're just left up there. Whereas I've seen, for example, people who are basically using the platforms to describe the racism that they've been subject to, or to publicize it, and their posts have been taken down for being racist or sexist or whatever else. So this thing currently is a mess. Also, there's the issue of so-called free speech. Now, I'm not dismissive of this wider issue. I think free speech is a very important value for the left, and I think that we want to be very careful about the circumstances in which we circumscribe speech. I'm not an absolutist about this. I recognize there are occasions when you have to circumscribe speech. However, it's a bit of a misnomer in this case, because as I understand it, free speech refers to, thou shalt not pass any laws, right? In other words, it's the Second Amendment in the US Constitution is the sort of paradigmatic instance. You cannot pass laws limiting speech, right? Everybody has to have the right to have their opinions, however awful they may be, and so on. Well, okay, so that's a legitimate thing to stand by, and you would have to be very careful about legislating for classes of speech that you're going to control. I'm not saying that you can't do that at all, but you would have to just be very careful. But the platforms are not engaged in the business of free speech. They are engaged in the business of using people's interactions to generate a certain amount of data, which and that data is, for them, something that they own. It's their intellectual monopoly. It's their property. And so when they come out and defend free speech, what they mean is that they must not be in any way inhibited from further generating data and income. Well, I don't claim to have the answer as to how you devise a set of protocols and regulations which we could all agree to, because the first condition for even getting to those protocols is that we must all be involved somehow. We can't agree to something that we didn't have any say in. I don't have any say in these Facebook protocols, and I don't trust them, and nor should anybody trust them. So therefore, I mentioned the case of Minitel, but we might want to look at, well, could we have platforms? Let's say in this country, we've got the BBC. I mean, it's not perfect. I have many criticisms of the BBC, but in principle, it's publicly owned. Could we have a BBC social media platform, right? It's certainly got the branding, the global cachet, it's got the money. And could it be run in such a way that the public would have a say over how it was run? And could it be run in such a way that there was no question of them trying to take your data? There was no question of you being spied on. There was no question of you being goaded into being addicted. They would just offer you the services and the entertainment and the fun and all the rest of it, while stripping out all the ways in which these companies are trying to, manipulate you and essentially destroy your life. I think that would get us closer to solving this problem of free speech. But, currently, we can't escape this bind. We can't escape this deadlock because, on the one hand, racism on the internet, sexism on the internet, homophobia on the internet, all of this stuff, it damages It hurts. It causes real harm. It's difficult to quantify that harm, but you know it when you see it. On the other hand, every time we get something banned or cancelled, it's arguable that the far right benefit, and that we are handing power over what can be said and what shouldn't be said to forces that don't have our interests at heart. So I don't have a simple answer to this. I don't claim that that if we just stand up for free speech in all cases, that'll solve the problem, because it won't. I also don't believe that we can trust the owners of these platforms to regulate for us. So we need to engage in a much bigger strategic thinking about this, and that would include thinking about the whole field of operation, and not just social media, but the whole of society. How do we intervene? Where do we intervene? What do we want in any given circumstance? Without judging it according to a prioris, like, do you support free speech or racist and sexist and so on? That's the only way I think we can get through this.
Yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than we think. So we've got a question here from Sinead. Do you think there is a solution to the increasing polarization of politics due to social media? And do you think there's a solution to the rise of the far right that we are seeing in social media as well as real life, presuming the two are linked?
I think there is some sort of link there. It would be, but I'm not sure if polarization is the right word for this. I've thought about this a lot, and I think political polarization I don't see as intrinsically a bad thing, because there can be, in real life, things happen. There are opposing interests. If you're working class, you don't have the same interests as the people who own your business. You want more wages, they want you to work for less and put more time in. All of that stuff, that's basic. But more generally, like, if you're subject to racism, you don't have the same interests as the racist. You probably don't have the same interests as the sort of policemen and women who you may call to report a racist incident. So there's legitimate antagonisms in society every day. Now, it isn't always a good idea to sort of, exacerbate those antagonisms. Sometimes they can be wildly unproductive, but that's true. But at the same time, people have a right to defend themselves, their interests, their living standards, their livelihoods, their physical well-being, etc. So that's just going to produce a polarized society, particularly when we've just gone through a major capitalist crisis, and now we're in this sort of second one in the space of a decade or so, particularly when the majority of people have suffered a real terms loss of income, real terms loss of status and pay and all the rest of it, particularly when there's been this huge fight over Brexit in the UK, but there's everywhere there's these fights brewing over nationalism. So polarization is not necessarily a bad thing. That's the point I wanted to make there. However, what we've seen on the internet is repeatedly, partly due to the mechanisms of these social industry platforms, the creation of a certain kind of cultural polarization, culture wars, which are not exactly the same thing as the sort of political antagonisms that we experience on a daily basis, but rather they form, the internet helps people form cultural tribes around emerging issues like Gamergate, hashtag Gamergate, or Birthergate, or whatever. And it sorts people into, through its logic of aggregation, it sorts people into these opposing tribes, and it ossifies and rigidifies those divisions. And out of those fights, those cauldrons, which generate a lot of money for these social industry platforms, out of those rows, generally speaking, we see it's the far right that benefits. Generally speaking, these culture wars arm reaction. They arm fascists. If you look at Gamergate, it was the MRA. It was the men's rights activists. If you look at Birthergate, it was Trump and the authoritarian wing of the Tea Party. So I think that that's something that's built into the system. And it's just because it happens to be, first of all, it's you could say it's like a spandrel, a byproduct of the technical system that's set up to sort people in a certain way, to put like with like, and to separate people out into these constituencies so that they could be marketed to. But I think also it's the churn of it. In other words, the more volatile the system is, the more people are sort of like obsessed with who's doing what on Twitter, to the extent that people become very animated about it and will like try to, for example, during Gamergate, there were individuals who got swatted. You know that practice, where individuals like call SWAT team on another person that they dislike online. SWAT team turns up at the house fully armed and like believing that they're going to confront an armed incident. And it's not impossible that you would die in a circumstance like that. That SWAT team would kill you because you would have no idea what was going on. You would come out of your house. You would not necessarily put your hands up. You'd just be like, "What the heck's going on?" Has
this been done? This is happening.
Oh yeah, this has been done. People got swatted, and luckily during Gamergate they didn't die. But there have been cases of people getting swatted and dying. So, but you can see how people get sort of drawn into these fights, and it spills out into so-called meat space. Well, obviously, while that's very profitable for the industry, it also spits out like sparks from the cauldron, lone wolf killers. It spits out people who go and shoot up synagogues or go and shoot up mosques, or try and plow into crowds of people with their vehicles. And you can see these online cultures developing, the cultures of the lone wolfish, people who sort of like spend their time idolizing and celebrating Elliot Rodgers and, Alec Manassian and various other lone wolf killers. So I think that the question, though, was what is the solution to this? I think partly the solution is to, first of all, not to get sucked into that particular way of binarizing cultural conflict, and to try and approach the conflict orthogonally, right? In other words, if we can figure out, is there a way, for example, not to act in a way that strengthens the right, strengthens the far right in particular, and strengthens reaction, but actually splits their side? Can we come up with lines of attack, lines of campaigning issues, and so on, which actually divide them rather than uniting them? We can see that, Gamergate united a lot of people who didn't necessarily have much else in common, except that they resented women and their growing role in the workplace and their potential for achieving equality. And why did they resent women? Well, there are all sorts of different reasons. Probably some people just deep down misogynistic, don't want women to have equality. Probably some people believed that their own conditions were somehow being eroded by women and that there was a zero-sum game. All sorts of things going on there. But what can we use that would split those people up, that would break away a section of them, the softer wing, if you like? And, like this is what obviously, the left classically does. We look for material issues that pull the right's coalitions apart. But obviously, we're not going to deal with this problem. We're not going to address this problem purely by focusing on how the social industry works. Although I do think it is very important, and I do think that its valences of politicization overwhelmingly benefit the far right. But I think we're going to deal with this by confronting the underlying sources of nationalist feeling, because I think that's the major issue at the moment. What are the engines of nationalist feeling, and how does nationalism become a container for all these other things like misogyny, like anti-immigrant feeling, like racism, and so on? How does nationalism become a container for all your feelings of discontent, all your feelings of being offended and injured by the world, all the daily disappointments of your life that feed into an ethos of existential revenge. So, yeah, I think maybe we have to rethink our strategy with regard to the social industry and how we intervene. Certainly, we shouldn't get sucked into any of these online culture wars if we can avoid it. We shouldn't allow things to be polarized along those lines, because that's what the right wants. But we should look for where a more productive polarization is, right? That's what we need. We need the right line of antagonism to be drawn through the situation. And if we can do that, then we can marginalize the fascists and the neo-Nazis and the lone wolf killers and so on, and there will be a lot less carnage as a result.
Okay. Well, Richard, that's all we've got time for. It's been absolutely fascinating to speak with you. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing some of your knowledge with us today. Where can people find you online? Where would you recommend people to go after this talk?
Right. Well, number one, I am a hustler. I need to make money. Come to my Patreon, right? Patreon.com/Richard Seymour WTF. That's right. Patreon.com/Richard Seymour WTF. The WTF stands for what you think it does. So I need your support. I'm poor. I'm broke. Come and support this poor, struggling writer. Next thing, go to my Twitter account at Leninology, and you can keep up to date with the stuff that I say. I realize it's ironic, given the talk I've just given, that I should be directing you to my Twitter account, but that's my public face. And if I happen to get on television one day, I'll let you know about that too. Great.
Well, Richard, it's been a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.